You don't know.
Where's this go again? Chris. Where's this go again?
That's what you call one of them there clubs.
I don't know what it's for. I'm plugged in, you know. I'm just plugged in.
I'm gonna be there, come on.
What, 29,
Wow.
29 to 26? No, they're getting old, I'm
Yeah.
58.
Yeah, right here.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, not like charging, I'll be honest.
Oh,
Oh my. Oh, yes. Take a minute. Probably.
No, you sure?
Yeah, that might take a minute.
You got 755
that's so rude, I'm responding.
emails.
You know my email. Go to the Verizon.
You should go email issue.
Let's pull a Hillary Clinton, get your own server. Don't follow us.
Yeah.
Get a rag to go with it, you can wipe it clean.
Large. We talked for that.
Okay, we'll call the hearing to order now, and at this time, I'll turn it over to Solicitor York.
Thank you, Mr. Brewer. The time is now 6:30? Close. I'm not able to see the clock very well. We're here at the Monaca Borough Building for a public hearing before the Council of the Borough of Monaca to consider the application of the borough for a conditional accessory use permit under the Monaca Borough Zoning Ordinance, Section 245-60, which sets forth the general standards and criteria for conditional uses. And also Section 245-9, capital letter D, parentheses 2, which set forth other conditions for granting such a conditional use. The borough is requesting the grant of a conditional accessory use for the installation of solar panels on property that is currently occupied by the Taylor Avenue Reservoir and a building that is proposed to be constructed adjacent to the reservoir. I would ask at this time that Ms. Honig have a roll call so that we can set for the record those council members present.
Mr. Snyder,
Here.
Mrs. Rossi. Here. Mr. Mulder,
Here.
Mr. Michael,
Present.
Mr. Rossi,
Here.
Mr. Shotter,
Here.
Mr. Wilson, Mr. DiMarzio,
Present.
Mr. Zigarelli,
Here.
President Boer,
Present.
Mayor Ammeline.
Present.
Also note for the record that the Borough Manager, Mario Leone, is present, and as I understand it, will be providing testimony in this matter. Also present is a representative of Energy Independent Solutions LLC, Hal Saville. Did I pronounce your name correctly? Saville. Okay. Who also will be providing testimony. I understand from documents supplied to me that notice of tonight's hearing was advertised on January 11th and January 18th, both 2016, in the Beaver County Times. Was also supplied with, and will make part of the record, the conditional use application which was submitted on behalf of the borough by Manager Leon. I presume that if you haven't been supplied with a copy of that, council members, you will be if it's not already in your packets. So I would like at this point in the hearing to have all those who will be or intend to testify and give evidence to raise your right hand. I understand that some of the council members may have questions, but to the extent that you're offering substantive evidence aside from questions that you may have, then I would ask you also to raise your right hand and be sworn.
Jody,
Yes.
okay, would you, everybody stand? Or whoever's gonna testify. You do solemnly swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, as you sworn to God on the last great day, all answers are due?
I do.
Be seated.
At present, we don't have any citizens in attendance, but if some appear and wish to comment or offer evidence, then we would have them sworn at that time. We're first going to take some testimony from Mr. Leon, and I'll be asking questions. Then, at that point in time, we'll offer Mr. Leon for questioning by any member of council that has a question to ask. I would ask that for the benefit of everyone in the courtroom, particularly the court reporter, that you speak one at a time so that it's not difficult for her to take down two people talking at the same time. We'll also provide that same admonition to any members of the public that appear. So at this time, I'll ask Mr. Leon some questions. Would you identify yourself by giving your name?
Mario Leon Jr., and my position is Borough Manager of Zach.
Mr. Leon, you heard me recite that the notice of tonight's hearing was published in the Beaver County Times on 2 occasions, and an application was completed by yourself on behalf of the borough. Were those statements both correct?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Leon, can you just, in a few brief words, summarize what the basis of this conditional use application is and why the borough feels that it's needed?
The borough is requesting permission to construct a solar array, both a ground and roof mount, and based upon the ordinance, it requires a conditional use.
So as I understand it, there would be solar panels that are to be mounted both on ground level and on the roof of the structure that is proposed to be built on the property.
Correct.
We'll get into a little bit more detail on that regard. Would any use or structure that would be allowed, if permitted by council, would any of that violate the spirit and intent of the community development goals that the borough has set forth?
No.
Would the granting of the conditional use benefit the borough?
Yes.
And in what way or manner would it benefit the borough?
It would reduce the cost of utilities for the borough and the electric and solar panels we generate.
To your knowledge, would there be any dangerous conditions or other matters in conjunction with this request to erect solar panels that may be injurious to individuals or others who are in the area?
No, I'm not aware of any dangerous.
Are there any noxious conditions or odors that would be produced as a result of these solar panels?
No.
Would there be measures taken so that these solar panels are sited in a way and oriented so that appropriate landscaping could be supplied and erected?
As far as landscaping, none of that has been discussed. the perimeter of the facility is fenced and actually has slats through the fence, which would act as a screening mechanism in itself.
So it would be a barrier, a type of barrier.
Yes.
Are there any other things situated on the property where the solar panels are proposed to be erected?
The water reservoir and the pump house that houses the pumps that distribute the water through the system.
To your knowledge, how long have those facilities been located on this property?
Since the early 1900s, over 100 years.
So are both of those facilities still in use?
Yes.
And they help to supply the citizens of the borough of Monaco with potable drinking water?
Correct.
And to your knowledge, were there homes that were in existence at the time of or prior to the construction of the reservoir?
Yes, there were some of the farmsteads.
Farms, you said?
Yeah, it was all farmland when it was originally constructed.
Are there any other buildings on the property aside from the two that, the one that you mentioned and the reservoir?
There's a round structure that's called the gatehouse. That would be an additional structure on the building.
And what is that used for?
It just has control gates coming into the reservoir property.
Now you had indicated, or at least I had indicated, that there would be a building proposed for construction on that property.
Yes.
And what would be the purpose in constructing that building?
It would be a garage facility, an eight bay garage structure.
And what would be housed there?
Either police vehicles and or public works vehicles and equipment.
Or is there a need presently for housing for vehicles of that type in the borough of Monaco?
We always need additional storage for our fleet and equipment, but moving forward with the borough's plans of selling the library, which currently houses some of our police equipment, we're just being proactive in trying to facilitate a facility once the library is sold.
Would there be any dangers to the public or those residents positioned adjacent to this property that would be caused to any of them?
No, it would solely be vehicle and equipment storage. Would be no hazard materials or anything of that type.
Are the panels that are proposed to be erected on the building proposed to be sited in a way that would interfere with what the residents up there already look at, envision, and see every day?
I don't foresee that them being positioned in any way that would distract or deter what they're currently looking at. I don't know that I can answer that for the resident that they might see
Right.
from their house.
So what do they view now from their homes?
The fence, which will remain there for a majority of the property, and then it would be fronted with the garage, and then basically there's a grassy hillside.
Are they able to see the reservoir presently?
From the street, no. From inside their house, if they're on the second story looking out their window, they may be able to see the reservoir.
Would there be any adverse impact by the construction of these solar panels on the borough's water supply or sewage facilities?
No.
That would include any kind of water mains, sewer mains, laterals, service lines, anything like that?
No, it doesn't interfere with any of that.
Would there be any type of need for trash removal or things of that nature that the borough contracts out for its citizens on this site?
No.
Do you know approximately how, let me take a step back and ask you this, I should have asked you in the beginning. Can you identify the streets which surround this property?
Yes, the solar arrays would be fronting onto Welsh Avenue, and it would be between Fern Alley and Hazel Alley. And the front location for the reservoir is Taylor Alley.
And what is the reservoir known as locally here in the community?
The Taylor Avenue Reservoir.
You're looking at a picture. Was that taken from Google Maps?
Correct, yes.
And does it depict the current reservoir and the proposed building?
Yes,
And does it also propose or show where the solar panel array would be constructed on the ground level?
yes,
And are those the approximate positions as you know them to be, that are depicted on this photo?
yes.
So we're going to make that as Exhibit 1 and make it part of the hearing transcript. At this point, I'm going to defer further questioning of Mr. Leon. I'm going to have some other questions. At this point, if any of you on council have any questions, Mr. Leon will entertain them. But if you want to wait until we've finished with all the testimony to ask questions, we could do that as well. I'll do the hearing answer first. Okay, hearing none, then Mr. Leon will, you have a question now, Mr. Snyder?
Yeah, I mean, I was, concerned about the building that was going to be erected, and he clarified that, and he also clarified that, solar panels could possibly be erected on the pump house and the sanitation plant location.
I don't think
No, I
he
don't
said
think I
that.
said that.
But they could be utilized possibly
I'm not
The
following
roofs?
the question.
for the solar panel
Not at the
installation.
wastewater treatment
Yeah,
plant?
could they possibly,
Yeah, that hasn't been
potential-
something that has been looked at yet, but I'm sure it's possible.
What about like if a new, restroom was installed at the park, could the roof also be used as a possible potential solar panel site location?
Yeah, that could be a possibility.
How much, electricity we plan on generating with these solar panels?
Well, it's a 55.29 kW system, and not being very technically versed in all this as far as kilowatts that it would produce, but there was a chart in our packet, and I defer to Hal, that maybe he can explain that a little bit better than me.
I'll ask, just hold on a second. Do you have any other questions, Mr. Snyder?
No, thank you.
If you have others, you could ask them once we have the next witness testify, and then I'm going to ask both of them some additional questions. Sir, would you mind stepping forward and standing in a way that your back is not completely to your court reporter so that she can hear your question, and hear your answers, excuse me.
Is this okay?
That's good right there.
So,
Hang on a second. First, identify yourself by giving your name and your employer.
okay, I am Hal Saville, and I am employed by Energy Independent Solutions, known as EIS Solar.
And is that the entity that responded to a request for bids in this matter?
Yes, we were one of the bidders and the winning bidder.
Okay, real briefly, and I mean real briefly, explain the background of your company and what it does.
So we are an energy solutions company. We've been in operation for over 6 years. And the primary thrust of our business is as a solar contractor. We've installed over 250 solar systems throughout western Pennsylvania, and have done some of the largest ones in Pittsburgh.
Do you also supply the professional services that are needed aside from the construction aspects of a building of a solar panel array?
So yes, we also do service contracts and provide maintenance of systems in addition.
Can you provide to council a summary of what has been proposed for the site that Mr. Leon just identified?
Sure. So EIS in our proposal proposed the installation of 194 285 watt solar panels, providing a capacity of a little over 55 kilowatts of solar power. And that system is estimated to produce around 63,000 kilowatt hours annually, to answer your question.
What does that mean in English?
What that means in English is that that system will offset roughly 42% of the electricity needed to operate the pump house.
Would that result in an energy savings and in cost savings to the borough of Monaco?
Absolutely. And in particular, since the borough was lucky enough to get a good-sized grant to cover half the cost, there is a fairly attractive payback associated with the system, such that while the system has a useful life of at least 25 years, we estimated payback to occur somewhere in under 10 years.
Okay, what do you mean by the estimated payback?
What we do is we look at the cost of the system, the amount of energy that it can produce, and the rate that the borough pays for that energy, and based on that, we project out how long it would take for that system to pay for itself, such that beyond that period of time, in essence, that energy becomes free energy, if you will.
So the borough would not incur any costs to a traditional energy supplier to run that?
That portion of the bill,
Yes.
at 42%.
And so that's what you meant when you said it would be
Free energy.
free energy.
Yes.
You prepared some preliminary plans or designs for this project?
Yes, we actually worked with Mr. Leon to assist in getting the grant.
Have you also preliminarily decided where the panels would be sited on the property?
Yes, so when we originally did the proposal, or for the grant proposal, the design, at that time, the garage building was not necessarily part of that design. And so we had looked at putting about 180 panels, all as ground mounts on that property. And then at the time when the building came into the design as part of that, it made a lot of sense to put a number of those panels on the roof of the garage.
What are you proposing to place onto the garage? In other words, how many panels?
So on the garage would be 114 panels,
And how many panels would you be proposing to place on the ground?
80 in 4 pods of 20 each.
Prior to your company's designing of the area and looking at where the solar panels would be placed, were you made aware of and did you review the borough zoning ordinance in terms of the setback requirements, side lot requirements, etc.?
As far as you're talking about the period when we assisted with the design for the grant?
Either at that time or at any time since?
At the time we were doing the grant proposal, it wasn't a specific point of consideration or discussion. I have not seen the ordinance specifically to see what the setbacks are. But my understanding is based on where we were locating the panels, particularly given that the fence would cast a shadow such that we'd have to be set back for a certain distance from that. You also have basically a slope going uphill that we would be sufficiently set back in order to comply with all requirements.
That ordinance and the provisions of it appear as part of the zoning ordinance, chapter 245 of the Code of the Borough of Monaco. And in particular, they appear under section 245-9, which is in the R2 single family and 2 family residential district. Of course, that part of the ordinance, like many, sets forth side lot, front lot, back lot, building height requirements, etc. Is it the intention that everything that is to be constructed on the property with regard to these panels would be in compliance with those provisions of the zoning ordinance?
It's,
I could,
as far as it being an R2 situation, given that you already sort of have an exceptional use, I'm not quite sure how to address that.
Okay, well, what I mean by that is, right now, it's not a permitted accessory use.
Understood.
But it's allowable by the granting of a conditional use, which the borough is entertaining tonight and why we've convened here tonight.
Understood.
But as part of those conditions, there are certain requirements that still must be met. For example, the solar panels must be at least 5 feet from the front lot line of the property. So set back at least 5 feet. So your understanding is that it's going to meet that requirement.
Yes, with ease.
Do you know offhand the height of the panels?
So the panels that are going to be on the building, the roof of the building, will be roughly the same height as the building, to the extent that they only stand perhaps 3 or 4 inches above the actual roof surface. The panels that are in the ground-mounted arrays are going to be roughly about 3 feet high off the ground in the front of the array and about 12 to 15 feet above the ground in the back of the array.
And again, relating back to the panels that are on the roof, you said how much,
About a 3 or 4 inch standoff above the roof surface.
so it's essentially negligible.
Yes, I mean, in essence, it will become the surface of the roof as far as the look of the building.
Now, the principal use to which the energy that is going to be created will be for the reservoir and the pumping of the water.
So it's my understanding that since we are going to be interconnecting at the pump house, and there is a meter located there which covers the use of energy at the pump house, that the energy we produce will offset the energy consumed on that meter.
So the purpose of it is not to create and sell power, it's primarily to help pump water.
That's right. And given the size of the array that is being built, given that it will only supply about 42% of the overall usage of that building, I can't anticipate a situation where you would have enough of a surplus that you would actually be selling power back to the grid beyond that which would be used to offset consumption.
If there was excess power created, then it could be sold to the grid?
Yes, that's the law of the state of Pennsylvania.
So again, the ground-mounted system will not be more than 20 feet high.
No.
Will there be some mechanical equipment that is to be located on the property to be used in connection with these solar panel arrays?
So, it depends on what you mean by mechanical. There are no really moving parts in this system. There are electronic components, the primary of which are inverters. So this system is designed to work with 3 inverters. That's the piece of equipment that converts the power from DC to AC power. There will also be a couple other, in addition to the wiring and the conduits, the balance of system includes things like combiner boxes, manual shutoffs, meters that monitor the amount of energy that's going to be produced. And there will also be a monitoring system that will collect data throughout the day and upload that to the internet so that information is available on the production of energy.
Will all those be located within the confines of the property itself?
They will.
And will they all be located behind any kind of decorative fencing or other shrubbery that would shield it from the view of the public?
So we're talking about relatively small equipment relative to the scale of the solar arrays themselves. Presumably for the arrays that are going to be the ground-mounted arrays, they will probably be located underneath those arrays and therefore really only visible if you were standing within the property, like up on top of the reservoir. And for the panels that are going to be on the roof of the garage, presumably they would be located inside the garage.
Will these panels produce either solar radiation or glare, or are they capable of producing that?
When you say solar radiation, they're going to be absorbing solar radiation, turn it into electricity. The surface of them, on a hot day can, be upwards of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. As far as glare goes, generally the angle of the panels would negate the possibility that somebody on the ground or even in a nearby residential building would see any glare at all based on the angle that the sun is at. Generally, it's kind of if there's any reflection, it's up sort of into the air.
So would it be fair to say that any kind of radiation or glare will not be directed onto nearby property?
That's right.
We are not far from the Greater Pittsburgh International Airport. Is there anything about the positioning or erection of these panels that would interfere with the operation of that facility and the airplanes which take off and land?
No, and frankly, that is a concern that is often raised, that there would be some sort of glare that the airplanes would see. Frankly, many airports have solar panels located on their own property, and it's not a concern. It's the scale of the size of solar panels relative to sort of the vista that the pilots are looking at from that height is really insignificant.
Will there be the construction of power transmission lines in connection with this project?
So what is planned is for a conduit with wiring in it to be run underground, basically from the garage back to the pump house, which would include the wiring also from the ground arrays. So basically you would have a plastic, a PVC conduit with all the wiring running through it that would be buried underground around the edge of the reservoir that runs back and connects into the pump house.
So none of it will be above ground?
That's right.
Aside from any kind of manufacturing or manufacturer's information, warning devices, labels, things like that, will there be any other form of advertising on any part or parts of these solar panel arrays or the appurtenances that go with it?
No, I mean, we plan no signage promoting our company. The solar panels do have, the maker's mark on them, identifying the company that they're from. But other than that, Any other signage that we provide is basically required by the electrical code to inform people of where energy is and how to treat it safely.
And one of the conditions that's imposed prior to construction is to secure a building or a zoning permit, which really would be substituted for if this is granted tonight. Would your company comply with that?
Yes, that's something we do routinely, and that's something that's already part of the contract that we have proposed to the borough.
Does this system that you're proposing to construct there meet all applicable industry standards?
It does.
And would it be constructed in accordance with the Pennsylvania Uniform Construction Code?
It would, as well as the National Electrical Code.
Would you be able to supply the borough with certificates of design compliance that would be obtained from the manufacturer of the equipment?
We would be providing that both from the manufacturer and presumably also an engineer's, a stamped engineer's drawing.
That was my next question. So you would be able to get us,
As well as an insurance certificate.
that would be the next question after that.
And we've actually already supplied those to the borough as part of our proposal for the grant.
You would also, I assume, ensure that the energy system would comply with every aspect of the Monaca Borough ordinances to ensure that it's good structural integrity, that is the whole solar system.
And that's something that we do routinely in all the systems that we build.
And at the end of the project, the ownership of the system would belong to the Borough of Monaca.
Yes, there had been previously a consideration of doing a power purchase agreement, which would be different, but the decision was made to do a straight cash purchase, and therefore, once that contract is complete, ownership is conveyed to the borough.
Is there going to be disturbance of the ground or the earth in connection with the erection of the ground-mounted solar panel array?
There's likely to be some, depending upon weather conditions and just sort of the conditions of the lot itself, you know, how the grass is and whether there's any standing water or anything. But yes, there will be some disturbance, and it is spelled out in the scope of work of our contract, what we do and don't do in terms of remediating that. In particular, for example, when you dig a trench and lay the conduit, you'll have a humped up area where the dirt is, and really what you want to do is just let that sit and settle down before you try to reseed it and things like that. Generally, our treatment for the ground mounts themselves is to put a weed fabric and gravel underneath like crushed limestone underneath the panels so that there's not a weed growth problem. That's our general treatment.
What is the expected length of construction from the point when you first appear on the property to do work until you leave and turn ownership over to the borough?
So the timeline for installing ground-mounted systems is a little bit longer than roof-mounted systems because you basically have to go in, pour concrete and let it cure and then come back and work with it later, usually a week later. I would expect the work to happen probably in 2 phases where we would start perhaps with the ground mounts depending upon when the building is completed and get that work finished first and then move on to the building. So it's a little hard to say, you know, if we hit that timing just right to be able to do the one and then go on directly to the other. But in terms of the amount of time that we would be on site, once we start working on the project, we would keep going with it until it was finished versus going on to other projects. And the other being that we're looking probably at roughly 2 to 3 weeks of full-time on-site presence.
I just want to turn to Mr. Leone for just a few questions. Mr. Leone, with respect to the side lot, front lot, and back lot requirements, are you familiar with those and
Yes.
what the ordinance requires?
Yes.
Is the proposed construction of these panels such that it will be within those side back and front lot setbacks.
Yes, and there's plenty of room for variance as well. The rear lot setback for the garage structure or any accessory use is 5 feet, and the building is in excess of, the fence line is actually 10 feet from the roadway, and the building will sit back about 2 feet from that. So we're about 12 feet off of the back yard line. So there's about a 7-foot variance there. And then looking at the picture in Exhibit A, the ground mounts even sit further back than that. And side yards is also I believe 5-foot setback, and we have plenty of variance there as well.
What exists there today to shield the structures that are on this property from the public's view or neighbor's view?
Around the perimeter of the property is an 8-foot barbed wire slatted fence.
Okay, by sliding fence, you mean what?
It has fiberglass slatting going through the fence.
There was some mention made that because of that, the array that's ground mounted would have to be moved farther back from the property line.
Yes.
You agree with that?
Yes, yeah. They're positioned south facing, so based on the picture, the sun would be behind us, so the fence actually casts a shadow, so it would have to be set further back away from the fence.
Roughly 10 to 15 feet.
Is the borough prepared, if all goes well and this is granted, to accept ownership of these solar panel arrays and do whatever is necessary to keep them in compliance with all applicable borough zoning ordinances?
Yes.
I don't think I have any other questions for these two gentlemen. We can now allow you for questioning either one of you gentlemen by any members of council. And if you do have a question, could you direct it to whom you're asking the question? And as best you can, keep it in the form of a question. If you would later want to make a comment, you could say that you're making a comment. So we'll start to my left, Mr. Michael.
Yes, thank you. How resilient are these panels?
So the panels are surfaced with tempered glass, and they are designed to take a relatively good impact. There's an actual UL standard that they have to comply with that requires that they literally shoot a half-inch ball of ice at I think 45 miles an hour at the panel to make sure that they can withstand basically the impact of a hailstorm. Something like a softball being tossed at it, it's not going to break it. If somebody shoots a 22 out from short range, that'll do the trick, but there's only so much you can do. So, but to answer your question, they're very resilient. They're designed to be out in the weather for 25 to 35 years, and they have a track record of operating that way for that long. So
Is there a warranty with these?
there is. It's a
And
25-year performance warranty, which requires that not only do the panels continue to operate for 25 years, but they produce a certain amount of energy over time, such that after 25 years, they still have to be producing 80% of their original rated capacity.
And do we have a guarantee of that in our contract?
Yeah, it's a manufacturer
Okay.
guarantee.
Yeah.
The next thing I have is there any maintenance involved? Do they need cleaned, bird droppings, kids throwing rocks, whatever?
There's very little maintenance that's required in that there are no moving parts. As far as keeping them clean, the elements do that pretty well, particularly on a well-sloped roof or on a ground-mounted system. The steeper they are, the easier it is for them to stay clean. So any accumulation of dust, dirt, anything like that, pollen, tends to wash off relatively quickly. Likewise, snow sheets off relatively quickly, especially at a more steep angle. As far as other maintenance of the system, you know, what we recommend is perhaps once a year to hit them with a hose or a pressure washer just to keep them kind of looking their best. And as far as other warranties on the balance of the system, the inverters generally have a 10-year warranty that's extendable to 20. So you do anticipate that there may be some requirement of maintenance of the inverters over the life of the system.
And which do we have, Mr. Lynn? 10-year or 20?
Don't remember,
Generally, what we recommend is because the inverter technology is developing sort of faster than the panel's a relatively mature technology. And given that, what we recommend is that you go with a 10-year warranty and really see where the technology is 10 years from now. It's likely that the inverters will be more efficient, less expensive, and be worthwhile, you know, replacing when they need to be based on, you know, them failing or having some sort of an issue. But you could easily get 15 years, you know, before you would need to do anything.
Would the borough cost any upgrade? Would we incur any costs for upgrades? Or is that part of the contract
That would be
also?
part of the O&M on the system, yes.
Okay. And I don't know about solar panels, so I'm going to ask you this, sir. In the event that we need to replace a panel, is it on a grid system or can each individual panel be replaced by itself without interruption?
Yes. I mean, in order to make any electrical changes to a system, it needs to be shut off. But as far as if one panel goes bad, does the whole thing shut off or go bad? It does not. So if there's a problem with an individual panel, everything else basically keeps operating. The other thing is that as far as the panels themselves go, we have specified the Solar World panels, which have an extremely low failure rate, like 22 per million, and therefore they're just very reliable. The chance of a panel going bad is very low.
And the last question at this time, have you ever done this near a water supply or a water plant before?
Not specifically. We've done it in other municipal situations, but not specifically a reservoir.
All right, then I'm going to turn the question to Mr. Leon then. Have we cleared, or do we need to clear anything with DEP or EPA for that being so close to our water supply?
I believe all those issues have been addressed. We actually even went beyond due diligence here and had ground borings taken at the site to verify that none of the drilling for, the technical, caissons for the, when they did that work, based on the soil conditions, there did be no adverse conditions to the reservoir, and all those issues have been looked into.
At this time, thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Rossi?
I'm not at this time.
Mr. Schroeder?
I have a few questions. How did you arrive at the annual output calculations for the system? Specifically, what did you use for your solar radiation values and your performance ratios?
So we have a computer program
Okay.
which is utilized. It's something called Clean Power Finance, and it is based on a whole series of calculations that are done. The local weather data from 60 years is taken into account, and also there is a coefficient of performance that is able to be calculated based on the orientation of the panels. In other words, how close to, dead perpendicular to the sun they sit, and on average throughout the day and throughout the year. And so the ground-mounted systems, because you generally have the ability to orient them in the best possible direction, tend to do the best, have the highest performance, and therefore they have that higher coefficient of performance. But because the garage is basically oriented almost exactly due south as well, it also has pretty good orientation. So basically, we look at the two different array orientations and the amount of capacity for each one, and based on the weather data, we sort of dump all that information into the program, and it comes up with that calculation. We then go back and double check it with a government-provided program, performance program called PV Watts, which is provided by the Department of Energy. So we double check it, and if the PV Watts number comes in lower, we actually downgrade it. In fact, we're sort of known for underestimating what our systems will produce, and we'd rather underpromise and overdeliver than the other way around.
You mentioned a 10-year payback. So as part of this calculation, did you take into consideration SRECs?
At a relatively low valuation. In fact, we had provided a valuation previously, and then based on the conversation that Mr. Leon and I had, we actually provided a second appraisal that was more conservative with a lower amount.
And at this time, what's that estimate?
We used a $10 average, which is pretty low.
Yeah, right now it's about 17, so I want to make
Yeah.
sure. I know we had one estimate in at $50 SREC.
Yeah.
Designs for the system, if there wasn't a building, would you be estimating then 180 panels would be your setup?
We had actually, when we did the grant proposal design, we did figure 180 panels, which was 9 modules of 20 each. And actually, that was what the RFP was based on. And then we decided to throw in a little extra. So we put in another 14 panels just to make the building look right. So we actually exceeded the capacity that was required at the same price.
And then finally, for this system, you mentioned that we're not planning on selling it back to the grid, but in looking over the RFP, there is no batteries installed in this as well, just because the technology isn't there for it to be worthwhile. In the instances that the pumps aren't running, will this in turn be net metering back to the system?
So when you have a grid interactive system, in essence, you are using the grid as your storage rather than batteries. So at any given moment, that energy could be flowing in either direction. It could be flowing back onto the grid if you have a surplus, or it could be you could be requiring additional power from the grid if you aren't producing enough from the solar at that particular moment. So that's the concept of net metering, where you're constantly going back and forth and you're paying only for the net of what you use after you subtract what the solar has provided.
Great. And then finally, for the SRECs, will EIS be acting as the brokerage firm for the sellback of these, or will it be a third party?
Yeah, we aren't in that part of the business. We have, typically we recommend 3 or 4 different power aggregators to utilize, and then it's up to the borough to decide which one it wants to use.
That's all, thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Wilson? Do you have any questions?
No questions at all, thank you.
Mr. Zigarelli?
No, thank you, Stuart.
Mayor?
Is the system set up that you would be able to add batteries?
You absolutely could. The question would be, where would it make sense to do that? And generally, if you're going to provide battery power for some sort of emergency backup, for example, you want to have that battery power close to the location where it would be used under those circumstances. So the question would become, where would it be important to have those batteries, and what could they theoretically do? So for example, you could potentially have them at the pump house, but how much would you need to actually operate the pumps and that sort of thing? You could potentially locate them at the garage to have some sort of emergency backup power there, perhaps for communications or lighting. It's really a matter of how big of a battery bank are we talking about, and what would it be capable of?
Well, I guess it would be the garage, the pumps, and then even maybe so, or garage for the employees. I mean, would it be capable of doing that?
You're talking about the other garages to be back behind the reservoir?
Yes.
Really, the issue is scale.
Okay.
You would be talking about a relatively large battery system to make that happen, and my expectation is that generators might well be a more feasible solution for some of that. Not that we wouldn't love to sell you some batteries
Sure,
as
right.
well, but we wouldn't want to do it unless it would make good sense where it was located.
Appreciate your honesty, thank you.
President Boer,
Nothing at this time.
Mr. DiMarzio.
Yeah, a couple of questions here. We heard science, technology, let's talk economics. What's this thing costing? What's it costing?
It's $150,000
Okay,
Total project.
$150K,
with a $75,000 grant.
okay. And we match it, right? And we have this budgeted in the 2016 budget?
Yes, the monies are in the account to do this on the borough, but we're looking at some other creative financing with our current utility provider, Constellation, where they will actually, the energy that it's generating will offset, so we'll continue paying our bill at the existing rate, and that amount pays it off. But right now, they only go 5 years. We're looking at, from an economic standpoint, I believe it was looking to generate about $7,500 in utility savings. So that's a 10-year payback just on flat utility savings. But then we talk this SREX, which is additional credits. Currently it's $17. I forget the exact amount of credits that this unit provides. But if we get 70 to 20, that expedites the payback down. But just on traditional utility cost, without the SREX, we're looking at a 10-year payback. That's a worst case scenario. We know that SREX are at 17 now. So it's anywhere from, best case scenario was 7.5 years, and the worst case 10. So, but we do have the current funds available, but not to utilize those monies in case something else arises. If I can put together some type of financing to not have to put that out, we're still looking at it.
Well, I appreciate that, Mr. Leonka, because I wanted the rest of council to hear that, you know, we're not financially strapped with that. In that regard, you did plan for it, and it falls in line with the ROI of 10 years that this gentleman had indicated before. Thank you.
And I think an important point just to highlight it for everyone to understand, and indicating that this system lasts 25 years and can last 35 years. But, you know, a condition that we might be facing, at 25 years, we might find out that there's solar panels that are more efficient, and it may behoove the council that's sitting there at that time to re-explore this and possibly putting the newer panels on it because it's going to generate you a higher return. So that's kind of the scenario. But we projected it at a 25-year project, generating a savings in excess of $200,000 for the borough. If we just maintain it and keep it for 35 years, again, it's only the efficiencies at 80%, but there's 10 more years of additional electricity savings, and 25 years from now, the price per kilowatt with inflation will be a lot higher. So the essence of this system, doing $250,000 in savings is theoretically possible.
If I may add, oftentimes we project an annual inflation rate of 7.5% in terms of the cost of electricity. In this case, we use a very conservative number, only 3%. So, if anything, you know, it should be very realistic based on, you know, what the energy consumption inflation rate are.
Mr. Mulder,
Nothing, thank you.
Ms. Testovich.
How long, you said how long does it take before we start losing efficiency? So like it should work at 100% for 5 years?
So, there is a curve, which I'll have to show you. And what happens is that the panels very gradually over time become a little bit less efficient. And if I can, I'm just going to pass this around. But basically, there is a curve that goes from 100% to 80% after 25 years. But it's not like in year 26, they stop running. They just keep producing a little bit less power. So maybe after 30 years, they're at 75%, and at 35 years, they're at 70%, and they keep going. So, so it's really pretty much a linear curve.
So if you start about and everywhere going, you know.
It's a straight line down. And that's actually reflected, I don't know if you all got a copy of the proposal that we had put together, but if you look at the 25-year cash flow analysis, it shows each year that basically the amount of power that's being produced is slightly less each year as reflected in the SREC value, which presumably is based on a constant dollar amount because it's producing a little bit less power each year.
Any other questions, Ms. Desi? Mr. Snyder?
Yeah, I have two of them. Are there gonna be some fail-safe devices implemented in the, because I didn't hear you mention anything like that, because we're feeding this conduit back to the booster building, and that's where our primary pumps are for the reservoir, in case, something were to occur. I just want to make sure that, something would be in place to protect them.
So when you say fail-safe, are you referring to having some like reserve energy if the power goes out? Or are you saying that the pump house would be protected from any kind of failure of the solar system?
Any type of surge or any type of like that nature?
So the solar panel system itself, first of all, is designed so that if the power is out, unless it has some sort of a battery backup, that it does not operate. It automatically shuts off. So if there is a power outage, first of all, the solar system is going to shut down as well. It requires the grid to be up in order to operate. That's the definition of grid interactive. So that is a fail-safe right there. Beyond that, the equipment, the inverter equipment, also has the capability, if there's any sort of like ground fault or other condition where it can't operate properly, also to shut itself off. And that happens in the inverters themselves before the power would ever be outputted to the grid. Now, as far as the pump house itself, the wiring configuration there is not going to change substantially. It's still going to be all tied into the local breaker panel, the load center there, which is going to be tied into the grid, so that it's going to be getting its power, in essence, more from the grid than from the solar itself. And there are also manual shutoffs available so that if there is a problem with the system, first responders could basically go and flip a switch and isolate the solar from the rest of the grid.
Would the circuit interrupter be better? I mean, because
That's all built in.
based on time.
That's already built into the
Gotcha.
inverters. So the manual shutoff is really redundant. It's required by the utility, but based on the way the inverters work, it's redundant.
Okay, and would you do me a favor, explain how solar energy is created?
I'd love to.
Because
I
I
refer to it as magic.
maybe some people don't know, and this
Sure.
might,
No.
open.
Okay, sure. So basically,
Mr. Selwa, I just ask for the benefit of the public that if you make it in English and as succinct as you can.
I'll give it my best shot. Solar energy is basically light energy, but it's also electromagnetic energy. And when the light hits the solar panels, the electrons from the solar energy are transferred into the silicon of the solar panels such that it creates a current where you have a positive and a negative pole, and the energy moves between those two. On each solar panel, which has many cells on it, the current on that little tiny cell isn't much. It's only a volt or two. But when you add all those up on all those panels, it becomes a much higher voltage and a flow of current. And that is what is captured by the solar panels as DC power, the same kind of power that is in batteries, for example, or whenever we plug in our cell phone or whatever else has a little power pack, it converts it back to DC power. So in this case, though, we need to convert it from DC to AC power in order to put it back out onto the grid and use it in the building or wherever else in the pump house. So there is an inverter which changes the DC power to AC power. And that is the main electrical conversion that happens in the system. So basically the sunlight hits the silicon on the panels, creates a current. That current is magnified by adding all those small currents together and then is put through the inverter to change it from DC to AC power. How's that?
Perfect. Just one more question. Right now, you're saying that that's gonna produce 55.29 kilowatts. Currently, residents, we use kilowatts at our house. And we pay, if you look at your monthly bill, whatever the companies are selling that to you, what could the amount and then multiplying these kilowatts give us a rough estimate, and then again use to determine how much kilowatts are going to be used
Sure.
at that particular facility?
I understand the question. So when you talk about kilowatts, that's a measure of electrical capacity. When you talk about the power that you consume in a residence or a business, you have to add a time factor. So the kilowatt hours, which is kilowatts of capacity over a certain amount of time. For example, an hour. So a kilowatt hour is basically the use of 100 watts of capacity during 1 hour's worth of time. So there is a coefficient of performance that I mentioned earlier that indicates, based on the number of kilowatts of capacity and the way those panels are oriented, how many kilowatt hours they will produce over a year, based on our local weather conditions, how much sunlight we get. So, for example, those ground-mounted units, which are located facing basically directly due south, are likely to, there's 80 of those panels and 285 watts. That's about 22 kilowatts of capacity. And based on that ideal orientation, I would expect them to produce in the range of about 27 or 28 thousand kilowatt hours annually. So we basically have a coefficient, a number, a factor of about 1.15 to 1.2, which is the performance coefficient, the factor. And so based on the size of the system, the way the panels are oriented, we're able to see how much power they ought to produce in this area based on local weather. So I don't know if I answered your question.
I'm fine with that. And just one more quick thing. You know that they built a power plant, I believe in Barstow, California, and they use a similar method. They use mirrors in order to absorb the sun, and that's how they heat the boiler. And those mirrors are set up on a computer, so they revolve with the sun in order to absorb the most potential, because the sun's always moving. Do we have is there some kind of option like that, so we get more bang for our buck, is what I'm getting at?
Sure. So, two things. One is that is actually a very different technology in that that's really a thermal technology. That's heating a salt fluid to create heat to run a generator. But to answer your question, there are photovoltaic tracking systems for these types of panels that are used in certain places. Generally not here in the eastern part of the country, because the additional energy gained by tracking does not offset the additional cost and expense of maintaining that mechanical system. So basically, it would cost more to have them tracked than the additional energy that you could capture that way.
So my answer is, if we lived in Arizona, it'd be more feasible, because you get more sunlight.
That's a good observation.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Michael, I think you had one other question?
Yes, I do, thank you. First to Mr. Leone, since the ground panels can't be moved, is the pitch of this roof going to match the ground panels to get optimum results?
The pitch of the roof, we had to look at it in two components. And I believe the pitch of the roof is a 412, and it becomes a constructability aspect because the higher the pitch and the thing. But I believe a 412 is a very good coefficient for an angle of it. Obviously, a slightly higher angle would generate potentially a little more energy, but when you look at the cost of to put a higher pitched roof and you get to the payback and then what the building would look like, so this was the most economical and feasible alternative.
If I may, we're always looking for the economic sweet spot, and Mr. Leone is right. The additional performance factor that you would get out of the difference between the 412 and the 712 roof is negligible, less than 5% difference.
And is this system all-inclusive, or can it be added to?
The system that we've proposed is, first of all, a total turnkey solution, so it's complete, all the labor and all the other costs is included. It could be added on to, but you would be adding additional equipment like inverters. In other words, the inverters are sized to the size of system that we are installing. So it isn't like there's like excess capacity there that you could add to. You would be adding other inverters as you went. One of the conditions would be space. So if you wanted to add on to it, where would you do that? And just if I can sort of give you my opinion, my guess is that you might well find other properties that the borough owns that might also be good prospects for putting solar on once you've maxed out that space at the reservoir. I mean, there was a certain amount of space that was sort of available to do this, and we used the best space up.
But roof mounting is cheaper?
Roof mounting is generally cheaper. It depends on the scale of the project. But generally, it's a little bit cheaper to do in sort of the scales that we're talking about.
And Mr. Leone, the only reason I brought that up is behind the paragraph here, we've got the Public Works building that seems to be at least twice the size of the large panel that's going to be mounted on this roof. I don't know if we considered that for expansion or not.
Well, we absolutely did, and the project, the evolution of it, we actually were trying to put solar panels on the actual reservoir and constructing a roof, but the cost of the structure, it didn't work out. But if you look at the structure here, the picture, this is north, south, so this roof will be angled, this way here, catching it as south facing.
Right.
And the road garage is oriented in the wrong
East-west.
the wrong direction. Yeah, so, yeah, we would love to utilize that building for it, but it's just oriented the wrong way.
Thank you, sir.
And not that you couldn't use an east or west exposure, but it's less desirable. So you're always looking to sort of get the best result.
Thank you.
Just wanted to do a couple things unless anyone else has any questions.
And just, if I could take a moment, one more important, I think, with a couple of firemen in the room, part of your proposal, when we talked about emergency safety, you will do training with our volunteer firemen in the event of a fire at that structure, the procedures that they would need to take.
Yes, that's something that we've offered to do within the balance of the contract.
Mr. Schroeder?
Expanding on the volunteer service, for a response to this, does it require anything such as a phone system to extinguish the fires?
There's no specific chemical or material quality that would require special it's not like a toxic substance that would require some specific type of treatment.
Right.
And I have to say that fires in solar systems are very rare.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Understandably so, I'm just,
properly designed and built systems don't catch fire.
I'm just inquiring because at the present time, our departments are a water-only system. We do not have a foam capability, so we just want to make sure that we'd have those capabilities if necessary.
I'm not aware of any special requirement that foam be used on solar panels.
Before we turn to the public with any kind of questions or comments, I want to first reiterate that we're attaching the Google image of the property and the facilities we were talking about as Exhibit 1. Exhibit 2 will be a copy of the public notice of tonight's hearing, and Exhibit 3 will be the application submitted by the borough. And for reference purposes, the parcel number affixed to this project is 37002-0807. Obviously, it's owned by the borough, and the property location is Taylor Avenue. The lot numbers are 522 to 533 in the Welch, W-E-L-C-H, plan of lots. Having said all that, is there anybody who is in attendance here tonight from the public that has any questions of either of the gentlemen that have testified?
Yes, I have a question.
You want to identify yourself and ask your question?
Yes, Kurt DeJoven, operator, Borough Monaca. My question was regarding the interface, how it is interfaced into the grid. You said when there was a power outage, that the solar array would drop out with the power outage.
Yes.
The backup generator system would kick on through the switchgear system. How would that system be, how would it be affected during a power outage when the backup generator system would kick on?
So generally, the order in which the panels, the solar system and the generator are located relative to the meter and the source of power are put in proper order, that the solar basically drops out and allows the generator to do its work. When the generator shuts off, the solar has the capacity to come back on without interfering with the generator.
That's all.
Any other comments or questions before we close the hearing? Mr. Sal, I want to thank you very much for attending, answering the questions,
I have my one sheet back there.
and for your patience with us all. And thanks also to Mr. Leon for the same reasons. If there are no other questions and nothing else to be brought before council on this matter, we'll close the hearing. Thank you.